What are the healthiest foods that people should eat on a daily basis to help them lose weight and balance their blood sugar?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think everyone is coming around to this idea of sugar balance and ensuring that we don't have glucose spikes and the corresponding glucose crashes. And so I think the interest in this subject is definitely warranted as it relates to losing weight as well, as most people in the UK and the US need to do. Unfortunately, we have a huge obesity crisis. We're the fattest nation in Europe,
Wow.
officially in the UK, running behind the US. I will point out, but still an issue. And when I talk about food, I think what trumps everything is composition quality. So, there are a number of different scoring systems now to determine how processed a food is. There's the Nova scoring system. There's a few others that we've got here in the UK. And I think the first thing you need to determine before you put anything in your mouth is this a whole food or not? Is this a food that is found most likely in nature, untouched, minimally processed? That's really what we want to be thinking about. Because I could tell you a whole list of different ingredients and different categories of ingredients, but in reality, what you need to focus on is the processing, because most of the ingredients that we come across in a supermarket are not whole food ingredients, as you know. They're mostly processed. And so whatever I say today, I'm going to give you a few categories and a few ingredients. That is the number one thing I want people to take away. Think about how processed an ingredient is. Typically, something that you can recognize, something that there's a saying around grandparents, if your grandparents could recognize this and cook with it, then it's probably something safe to eat. I think that's probably a good litmus test. But if there's one thing I want people to take away, it's beware of processed foods, minimize that to the maximum, and that's what will improve your blood sugar regulation and improve your ability to maintain good weight for you.
And what is the mechanism there? Like, I feel like everybody seems to be talking about like processed foods this, processed foods that, but like, how does it actually work from a biological standpoint?
Yeah, so there's two main things, I think. So when you disrupt the food matrix itself, you essentially change the way by which those nutrients can be absorbed into your body. So when you change, let's say, a carbohydrate like a bean, for example, or let's say whole wheat, for example, into something that is much, much more refined, not only are you stripping away a lot of the nutrients that you find in the whole food, but you're also changing the way in which your body hyper absorbs that. Oops.
there goes my backpack.
There's your bag.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah. That's the power of the information that you are delivering. Yeah. There's like seismic power in it.
I'm forcibly like moving, changing minds.
I love it.
Where was I? So yeah, you change the speed at which your body can absorb those nutrients. So in the form of carbohydrates, the more processing it is, the quicker that you're going to absorb the sugars, the quicker that's going to turn into glucose into your bloodstream, and you're going to cause this corresponding spike before your body gets a chance to respond to it appropriately with insulin and other processing. So that's one way in which it changes. The other thing, like I alluded to earlier, is that you're stripping away a lot of the nutrients as well. The B vitamins that you find in whole grains, for example, the different types of fibers are taken away. So that's something that's going to change, will remove the beneficial compounds that you find in whole foods. And the other thing is what we're adding to processed foods to make them hyper palatable. So things like refined oils, things like sugars as well that are packaged into that food to make it wholesome. Those are things that your body isn't used to consuming. And there's a whole bunch of other chemicals as well that we use in processed foods just to maintain shelf life. And look, I don't want to rag too much on the food industry because I think it's quite easy to, first off, but what they've been tasked with is essentially creating foods that are easily transportable, very cheap, and hyper palatable. And actually, that as a task, they did pretty damn well. The fact that we can eat in food deserts, the fact that I can drive up to Birmingham, which is for your American listeners around 200 miles away, and stop in the middle of the motorway and actually find something to eat. The reason why we have processed foods was mainly for that reason.
Yeah.
So we can travel between cities and not have to rely on those different elements. But at at that, there is a lot of cost associated with that as well. And the fact that they are hyperpalatable, the fact that they are over marketed, the fact that they genuinely target the most poor and the most vulnerable in society. This is why we do have a disparity in health outcomes as well. So, with those elements of processed foods, that's kind of why we need to be very, very careful about them as well. So, every now and then have a snack, indulge in something, but this shouldn't be the staple of your diet as is currently being promoted by a lot of these companies.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really fault food manufacturers, right? Like if I was in that business, I would want my products to be cheap.
Yeah.
I would want them to be delicious, right?
Yeah.
To create repeat customers. I would want them to be safe. I would want them to have all the characteristics that we ascribe to ultra processed foods today.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not done with malicious intent.
Yeah.
They're not created with the intent of driving obesity and non-communicable chronic disease. But the problem, I think, which you so eloquently alluded to, is that we tend to overconsume them today, and that's the primary issue.
And it's very easy too. There's the bliss point that they spend millions of dollars and pounds in research and developing, to get to that point where it does become something that you absolutely love. But there is a downside to that, and most people struggle to find the balance of overeating and using just as a sort of luxury rather than a staple in one's diet. There is. Obviously, when you think about it's funny you said the word malicious, and I think it's quite easy just to think that they are doing this because they want everyone to have type 2 diabetes. They want everyone to, increase their health costs to the country. I don't believe that, but there's definitely looking the other way of these food manufacturers. When you explain to them what's going on, there's a lot of lobbying to fight the other corner, unfortunately. So yeah, there's definitely looking on the other way, but I think they can definitely do a better job.
In the US, there's now data that suggests that 73% of the US food supply is ultra processed. 73% of the products found in your average supermarket, actually more accurately, are ultra processed, like fit that categorization.
Yeah.
Is that similar over here?
I would say it's probably the same. And, it's funny, when I talk about processed foods to people, most people imagine the sort of garish cartoon laden products, cereal boxes, there's bars and all that kind of stuff. Actually, a lot of healthy foods, quote unquote healthy foods, like healthy bars and energy balls and all this stuff that has been, painted with a sort of natural look, dark green, mahogany, all those kind of color palettes, are pretty unhealthy as well. Because if you think about the processing that's involved in those products, you're stripping away a lot of the natural fibers, you're combining it with a whole bunch of gels, you're adding other additives that make it more shelf stable, you're putting it in, you're essentially putting it in a package to make it transportable. So a lot of these processing categories actually apply to quote unquote healthful foods as well. So you've got to be pretty careful. And what I'm trying to help people develop is a health reflex. So when you look at a product on a store shelf, when you are in a convenience store, wherever you might be, you have a general inclination to not just grab the item based on the claims on the front of it. You actually turn it over and you read the back of the ingredients and you try and determine for yourself, is this something that I want to eat today? Or is this something that I'm going to put back and then opt for something else that's a lot more wholesome?
Brilliant. Are there many other doctors that think like you in the UK?
I think when I started out 6 years ago, I was probably one of the very few. I know you've spoken to Rungan, for example. There's A.M. Panja. There's a bunch of us that have been talking about this for a little while, but it's definitely becoming a lot more popular today. And one of the things that I wanted to do actually quite early in my career is actually educate a lot more, not just doctors, but other allied health professionals about the beauty of food and the medicinal effects of eating well. And so one thing that I borrowed from the States was a culinary medicine course that is currently being taught at Tulane Medical School. I believe Harvard Med School and Columbia also had a culinary medicine module in the early 2000s as well. And what we did as a nonprofit is start teaching medical students as part of their electives. So during their medical school, they have 2 to 3 weeks where they do a specialty subject. Some of them do neurosurgery, some of them do plastics, some of them do immunology. And we actually put culinary medicine as a module where we taught them the basics of cooking for themselves, but also how you empower patients to eat well and develop these sort of health reflexes as well. So one of the things that I think I'm really proud of is actually being involved in this nonprofit and teaching over 1,000+ health professionals how they can start having these conversations. And obviously that's sort of it's grown over the last few years. So yeah, I think there's definitely to answer your question more directly, I think there's definitely a growing number of medical professionals in the UK, but still much smaller than it should be.
Do you get pushback?
Yeah, man.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we've chatted about this in the past. For sure, man. Like, whenever you're putting your head above the parapet, so to speak, you're always going to get shot down. This doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. He hasn't got a nutrition degree. He's trying to replace nutritionists and dietitians. He's promoting eating unhealthy eating habits that can lead to eating disorders. Whatever sort of angle you want, I kind of had it. And I think one of the things that I'm really grateful for are those experiences, because it makes you a lot more resilient. It makes you a lot more refined with the evidence base. The references I put in my first and second book, for example, are in the hundreds. I've now gone on to do my master's in nutritional medicine, alongside a whole bunch of other people, from general practice to ITU to anaesthetists as well. So there is this sort of conversation, and for all the put downs, I think when I look back over the last few years, I think I've kind of come around the other side relatively unscathed and stronger for it. So, for anyone that's having a moment where they're feeling like they're alone, or they're having sort of a second guess moment where they're like, am I really right? Or is this the right thing to do? Or everyone's calling me out and that kind of stuff. Like, you just got to believe in yourself. And if you strongly believe in your truth, then you just got to lay it all out there.
Yeah, as long as your values are in the right place.
Yeah, and I think you also got to be willing to be wrong, right? So, some of the things that I might have changed my opinion on over the last couple of years include things like, the value of LDL-C and ApoB containing lipoproteins, for example. I think I would have swayed towards it not being as important as I now believe it to be. And that's, in light of speaking to lipidologists and listening to other preventative cardiologists, for example. I've become probably more bullish on things like glucose hacks and actually the importance of maintaining good balanced glucose levels using things like continuous glucose monitors. I would have thought that might have been something that was outside the realm of attainability for most people, and perhaps it wasn't something that was necessary. Actually, I think I'm subscribing to this idea of what gets measured gets managed. And actually, for certain people, having that amount of information is actually quite a motivational thing. Is actually something that can push people toward better behaviors. And so, I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to sort of like lay it out there and say, you know what, I've actually changed my opinion on this. But broadly speaking, the sort of themes that have come out of me, doing the research and looking at nutrition studies for the last 10-15 years and having my own personal experiences with my own health and my patients' health, I wouldn't say there's much that I've changed my mind on, but I'm certainly willing to be educated. That as long as there are scientists in the world that are doing some great stuff in the lab and beyond.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's just that the vitriol that you sometimes get in the online nutrition space, I just feel like it makes, at the end of the day, whether a person is right or wrong, if you get the sense that their values are aligned and they're doing it from a place of like authentic empathy and care, then like, why attack? It's okay to call people to like DM people and be like, hey, you might want to check this reference or check your wording on that. Maybe it's getting a little bit ahead of the science. But the culture online now is such that it's like this call out culture.
Yeah, yeah. I call it outrage culture. Like
Yeah.
it's almost like we want to be outraged. It's
Mm.
almost like we surf the internet, using a '90s term there, to sort of like look for things that could trigger us. And I think, we do have a human negativity bias. I get that,
Yeah.
but sometimes I think this sort of culture of public shaming is well out of whack. And actually, when you think about why you're doing the calling out or whatever it might be, it's probably more so narcissistic than it is a public service, which is sort
Absolutely.
of like the virtue signaling fence that people put around as to why they do that in the first place.
Yes. Yeah, it's not coming from, see, I don't believe that it's coming from a place of I'm just doing this out of virtue so that I can help people separate fact from fiction and see the truth of new. I think it's actually just another form of clout chasing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they've realized, that the algorithm tends to favor that kind of content.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And you see it from both sides, right? Like
Yeah.
you would purposely put something out that's going to be controversial, it's going to rub certain people up the wrong way, because you know that increases engagement
Yeah.
and increases the number of comments you're going to put out there. It's funny, I was chatting to Johan Hari on the podcast.
Sapiens.
No, that's Yuval Hari. This
Oh,
is Johan Hari.
damn.
He did Chasing the Scream, that was turned into like a Netflix documentary with Samuel L. Jackson doing the narration on it. And his latest book is called Stolen Focus. He's also been on Steve Bartlett's Diary of a CEO as well. Really, really good podcast. Very, very good communicator. And his book, Stolen Focus, is all about technology and how these social media companies have sort of trended towards those sort of like shouty sort of figures, and actually because they know that's what's going to get more people on, that's going to get more engagement, you're going to get more daily active users, and that's why they're trending towards that as the algorithm. And so his sort of analysis of tech sort of explains a lot of what we see in nutrition culture online and on social media, right? We're basically all being trained to be as loud and as vitriolic as possible and as controversial as possible.
So screwed up.
It is kind of screwed up. And I see it like, this is something that I've been doing a lot of soul searching on myself, because, I've done like 5 books now. The app came out. I'm doing the culinary medicine nonprofit thing as well. I do talks, and as you do as well, with the podcast, like having tons of downloads. But at the same time, it's at a backdrop of where people have never been unhealthier, right? We have rising rates of cancer, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia obviously is on the rise. You have this huge sort of health inequality that's deepening as well as a result of cost of living crisis and inequalities within finances. And what I'm really obsessed with trying to create is impact. I've been a medical doctor for like 15 years. One of the reasons why I'm now transitioning into doing Doctor's Kitchen full time is because I feel like I want to be able to scale the impact I can in preventative medicine. And the only way I'm going to do that is if I double down on this rather than seeing one patient at a time, right? It's just not an efficient way of trying to get the message out there. And I'm with everything I've done thus far, yes, I could qualify that I've done a better job than I could do if I was seeing patients one-on-one in a general practice setting. But am I having a massive nationwide impact or global impact? I don't know. I can't think. I don't think I can qualify that right now. And so that's why I started the tech company, because tech has this incredible ability to, as we've just discussed, have a massive positive and negative effect. And I feel that the implementation of all the stuff that we talk about, the science, the nutrition, the healthy behavior change, all that kind of stuff, that can be magnified with the right digital product. So yeah, that's a bit of a tangent into sort of how I'm feeling about tech and this position that I'm in, where I've got a bit of influence and I just want to have the biggest scaled impact as possible.
Of course, yeah. Well, and you're having a massive impact already. So I'm excited to see where you go from here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just incredible. For people though that are like, feeling overwhelmed, because I feel like part of one of the issues with just calling out my own industry, the wellness industry, is that at times it can seem very overwhelming for your
Yeah.
average person, right? Like, avoid all the endocrine disrupting chemicals in your environment, avoid the ultra processed foods. You got to sleep 9 hours a day, or you're
Mm.
doing something wrong. Or where should somebody like begin who's feeling overwhelmed, feeling a bit sort of lost within this space? Like,
Yeah.
how do you like triage your approach for somebody who's like kind of naive to all this?
Yeah, I have this saying that I remind everyone about, and it's the science is complex, the solutions are simple. Like, sleep 9 hours a day, eat this, don't eat that. Implementation, that's the hard stuff,
Hmm.
right? So, like, we love to nerd out on all the stuff around the microbiota, your gut-brain connection and anti-inflammatory chemicals and EDCs and all the rest of it. That's all the science stuff. The solutions, it sounds really simple, right? I remember when I was a young general practitioner around 10 years ago or so, I remember thinking to myself, oh, I just lay out the information to my patients and then they'll just get it. Like, if I tell them to eat these nuts and these greens and, have this kind of meat and less of that kind of meat, they'll just do it. No, that's not what happens at all. The implementation, that's the real tricky stuff, because it's not just following a list of guides or, a recipe book. It's getting and tapping into human psychology. It's getting into what makes people do things, what kind of traps people fall in, and what the other influences are on whether someone can actually maintain a healthy lifestyle. Is it finances? Is it stress? Is it trauma? Is it something to do with their education? All these different really, really varied things that can impact on whether someone actually is able to maintain a healthy lifestyle or not. So that's kind of like the way I kind of frame it to people. And if there's anything that we've learned from human behavior and psychologists and, people like BJ Fogg, for example, and his Tiny Habits sort of lectures from Stanford and the book as well, it's you've got to start really, really small. For most people, you have to start very, very small and then build and stack your habits on top of each other. And so the one thing that I did my TED Talk on was just a saying, just add one more. Can you add just one more fruit, vegetable, nut, or seed at every mealtime? Just one more. If you're having cereal, let's say, even if it's a ultra processed cereal that you have in the mornings, can you add nuts or seeds to that? If you're having a sandwich, we have something in the UK. It's meal deals. I don't know if you guys have that in the States.
What
or
is
not.
that?
A meal deal is like it's almost like the darling of like the sort of white collar worker in cities across the UK. It's like a sandwich, a bag of crisps, which is what you guys call chips, and like a can of Coke. And a meal deal is like amazing because you get all that for like less than £4 or something.
It's like a combo meal, value meal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a combo meal. It's probably not as bad as some of the junk food options that you guys have in the States. But, let's say even if you're having a meal deal, can you add like a piece of fruit to that? At dinner time, can you make a side of greens? And I know it doesn't sound like it would make any difference whatsoever, but it really does. Out of the thousands of patients that I've seen throughout my medical career, starting small with people rather than giving them a real sort of mammoth task to do from day one, that leads to consistency. If there's anything, the second thing I would want to emphasize to your listeners, if there's anything that really moves the needle, it is all about consistency. And one of the things that really painted this picture for me was the A to Z study by Professor Gardner from Stanford, I believe it was. And what they found is they put people on seemingly very different diets. They had a vegan diet, a low-fat diet, med diet, paleo diet, and they followed them up for a year, quite a long study. And what they found was that all of the participants lost weight. The biggest factor, and they used weight as an endpoint, BMI, I know it's got loads of issues with, but let's just put that to a side and just assume that loss of weight is generally going to be a good thing. Most people need to lose weight anyway. And what they found was that the biggest contributor to whether someone was successful in the diet or not was purely, or successful on the losing weight or not, was purely how likely they were to consistently keep
Yeah.
that diet. So whether you choose to go on a fully plant-based diet or a Mediterranean diet or even a paleo diet, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm kind of cognitively distant. I'm sort of separating my own sort of biases away from those diets. Whatever works for that person in front of me works for them. That's great. That's got to be a lot better than the standard American diet or the standard English diet or whatever sort of ultra processed junk food diet most people subscribe to today. So, for me, I think it's all about consistency, starting really, really small, and just acknowledging the fact that implementation of all this stuff that we talk about and we sort of inadvertently paint a picture of as being quite simple is actually quite hard to do.
It's quite hard to do, but the impact is massive. I love the concept of like add one more, right? Because it's compounding interest.
Yeah.
It's so easy to wrap your head around doing one more thing every day, or do it 1% better, right? Like do like 1% better today. Be 1% better today than you were yesterday. But if you're 1% better the next day, and then 1% better the next day, then I mean, after a year, who knows where you're gonna find yourself?
Absolutely. And I've got an example of I don't think I've talked about this particular case before, but I had an IBD patient who was relatively well controlled and some immunologics. And for those of you who don't know, inflammatory bowel disease, there's two different types. Generally, most people would respond to a high fiber diet, as well as all the other drugs that we do to suppress the immune system, as it's an autoimmune condition. And this particular gentleman came, and I think he was in his mid 40s when he saw me. And I remember asking him about diet, and I remember him sort of like raising his eyebrows and thinking, this is the first time anyone's asked me about my diet. And he'd been seen by other GPs, other sort of A&E consultants when he went in for flare-ups, unfortunately, which is something that can happen, and gastroenterologists as well. And I remember just dissecting his diet, and his diet was pretty horrific. And I don't mean to be judgmental about people's diets here, but McDonald's featured on it pretty regularly. And a lot of ultra high processed, very convenient foods that we tend to have in the morning, so breakfast cereals and all the rest of it. And I started thinking around this consistency piece for this particular person, and around the time I'd started changing my tact as to how I deliver this information and give people essentially very, very simple guides to maintain. And we started very, very small. I said, look, can you swap out one of your breakfasts once a week for this instead? It was just like some oats, some pumpkin seeds, something he could make the night before. And I remember over the course of around 6 to 8 months, we completely changed his diet, where he was still having the odd junk food meal because he was working on the road, and there's not many places where you can actually get a decent meal unless you're really prepared and you make yourself your lunch the day before. But this person had really massively increased their fiber content, lost weight, inflammatory markers came down, flares came right down as well. And actually his gastroenterologist who we were seeing actually reduced the dose of some of his medications.
Wow.
So, this isn't to sort of like be sniffed at. Even like changing someone's processed food diet to something that is less processed has a demonstrable impact as well. And it's those like, little anecdotes that just give me a little bit more sort of confidence that these are the sorts of messages we need to be exploring. These are the sorts of messages that we need to be promoting to people, because those little changes can be really powerful, as you said.
Yeah, and you're not saying that you can't eat your favorite ultra processed snack or confectionery product or even sugar sweetened beverage ever again.
Yeah.
You're not saying that. You're just saying to like cut it down. I mean, if you do any better than the norm, which today on average is like 60% of the calories that your average person consumes comes from these like kinds of like vending machine foods, essentially. If you do any better than that, I mean, you're going to see better health than the average.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's funny. I always get like sort of funny looks whenever I talk to people about my like dirty secrets, and not really dirty secrets, but my sort of like pleasures when it comes to food. Like I'm a big foodie, right? Like I cook for a living, and the reason why I've sort of developed a niche for healthy cooking is because I put like a flavor spin on it. I'm trying to like inject like color and cultural heritage into the recipes that I create, because eating should be fun. It's like one of the direct routes to pleasure. There's a reason why our dopamine system lights up with sugar, for example, when we see something delicious on a plate, and we can put a healthy spin on that as well.
Hmm.
And so, I think actually part of a healthy lifestyle has some junk food in it, has a bit of those sort of like luxury items that we use as a luxury rather than something that is enjoyed on a daily or like, a couple of times a week basis. I mean, I don't mean to sound puritanical, and that's why, I always want to emphasize the fact that every now and then I am going to have like a warm jam donut with like the jam oozing out of it and all the rest of it. But am I going to have that like once a week or even once a day? No, I'm probably not going to have that once a day. I'm going to enjoy it though when I do.
Love it. Love it. Balance. Yeah, it's so important.